Welcome to Behind the Album, where I'm going to reveal some of the astounding backstories that influenced some of the greatest albums. The conspiracies, the lies, the egos, the drugs, the arguments, the grudges, jealousies, the good bits. Every dirty secret you need to know about the albums you love. Disclaimer, though I have researched these albums and bands intensively, there are certain comments that I will make that are my assumptions and my assumptions only based on the aforesaid research. This episode, it's Fair Warning by Van Halen. Released in April of '81, it was the fourth offering from the band, reaching number 5 on US Billboard, making it the highest placed album so far for them. But it only just broke top 50 in the UK. Fair Warning marked a huge change in the Van Halen camp, a major shift in working dynamics. Behind the scenes, this was a volatile affair. In fact, it got so bad that I firmly believe that the seeds of their eventual breakup were sown in the making of this record. To put the scale of that disruption into perspective, let's examine what had been the norm for Van Halen before Fair Warning. Previous album, Women and Children First, a huge success. In Eddie Van Halen's own words, recording-wise, quote, took 4 days for the music and 6 days for the singing. A bunch of songs were first takes, end quotes. In and out, that's how they did it. And on the tour to promote the album, it was more of the same. The shows could be wild, drunken, chaotic, but it's Van Halen. It's all about the party. After the shows, it was, according to various onlookers, pure debauchery. So the band were living and acting the dream. But whose dream? And then totally out of the blue, something changed. Or rather, someone did. Eddie Van Halen. I don't think Eddie's heart had really been in all the debauchery in the first place. As artistic manager Pete Angelus, mispronounced, dubbed the 5th member of Van Halen by the band themselves, stated, everything was music for Edward. Edward wasn't as social a person as anyone else in the band, because he was dealing with his thoughts, his ideas all the time, end quote. As Eddie himself said, I'm pretty much a loner. I just can't get along with people. They don't understand me. I have nothing to say, end quote. Oh dear. Well, all that was about to change because solitary, tongue-tied Eddie presumably found someone who did understand. Because Eddie fell in love, as in off a cliff. Her name was Valerie Bertinelli and she was a TV star. It was a whirlwind romance. After 15 weeks, he asked her to marry him and she accepted. This may have been good for Eddie, but it wasn't good for the band. This wasn't the image Van Halen wanted. Being married is not rock and roll. Consequently, the band were not amused. Producer Ted Templeman said flat out that the entire group did not want him to marry, to rock the Van Halen boat. It particularly infuriated self-appointed band leader Dave Lee Roth, who repeatedly urged Eddie to reconsider. And when he couldn't talk him out of it, actually snubbed the wedding. Eddie's marriage drove a huge wedge between him and Roth, who he already had a pretty volatile relationship with. The superficial showman against the introverted musician. To quote Roth's own words, what Eddie and I do is argue. We come from different backgrounds, musically, philosophically, socially, our hobbies. I have trouble understanding more times than not why he does what he does. There are meeting grounds, of course, but in the musical end, there is no meeting ground, end quote. Couple that to Eddie actually overhearing Roth say this about his marriage, quote, that fucking little prick, not only is he winning all the guitar awards, but is also the first to marry a movie star, end quote. Jealousy is a terrible thing, Dave. So Eddie had caused a problem. for the band, and it turned out for himself. And it wasn't going to be an easy fix. For Eddie, there were no more groupies, no more debauchery. Now it was Valerie, and it was recording the new album. But this was easier said than done, because Eddie was constantly being pulled in two. On one side, there were arguments and fighting between himself and his fiancée, just trying to arrange a date to get married because of his recording commitments and her filming commitments. And of course, the band themselves, i.e. Dave Lee Roth, were giving him real grief. His getting married was bad enough. But what the hell was going on in the studio? Because Eddie had changed it up there as well. The new reformed Edward Van Halen as a person decided it was also time to mature as a disciplined musician and songwriter. It was time to take his time, resist the pressure to rush things through, not to kowtow to the rest of the band, i.e. Dave Lee Roth, and to an extent, I think, producer Ted Templeman. Eddie was going to do things his way, and the band, i.e. Dave Lee Roth and Ted Templeman, sure as hell didn't want or like that. Ted and Dave wanted to keep it light, keep it commercial, keep it quick, keep the bucks rolling in. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. They didn't need Eddie going all Bob the Builder, because Eddie could go all Bob the Builder, because Eddie wrote the songs. And when you write the songs, if you decide to, you can call the shots. And Eddie decided to. His bullets were aimed directly at past band dynamics. He was going to blow everything apart. It was going to be all change. You see, in the past, Eddie wrote the material and everything else had pretty much dictated by Dave Lee Roth. He made Van Halen in his own image. The band were perceived as a fun, party, drug-taking, sex on wheels, heavy drinking band because, well, Dave was. And in the studio, he sorted the lyrics, which were mostly about what Dave did, which was what Dave was. Dave also didn't like spending too long in the studio because when they were there, they couldn't put all their energies into doing the things that Dave liked, only some of them. And in this department, Roth had an unlikely ally in producer Ted Templeman. Ted liked to record fast, in as live a setting as possible. It was rumoured that on past Van Halen records he had even covered up the recording button, so the band didn't realise he was recording when they were rehearsing, and a lot of that went straight on the record. In the past, Eddie had gone along with it, but that didn't mean Eddie had liked it, because he hadn't, because he didn't, and that stopped now. The new Eddie was in a dark and dirty mood, and he wasn't fucking around. They were going to do things his way. Eddie's comments on the recording of Fair Warning are these, quote, "On the whole album, I was angry, frustrated and loose. We started doing things my way and we all kind of butted heads. It became me versus them," end quote. And Angry Eddie got his way. Fair Warning, consequently, is a dark, dirty, moody record, but far more importantly, it is also the hardest and heaviest record Van Halen had ever released, and in my opinion, that they ever did release. This was Eddie's baby. He worked relentlessly on that record, channeling all his anger and frustration straight into it. And when I say relentlessly, I mean it. This was a 24/7 affair for him. Of a day he would spend battling it out with Templeman and Roth over what he wanted to do, and then if he didn't like what he got, he and engineer Don Landy would sneak back into the studio and work through the night, re-recording and overdubbing. But what angered him especially, and probably reinforced his determination, was that no one in the band, or even producer Ted Templeman, ever realised what he'd done on these nighttime jaunts. As he said, quote, "The fucked up thing was that no one even noticed. That's how uninvolved they were on a musical level," end quote. And so we come to that awful 5-letter word that no one likes to mention in polite company. The 5-letter word that had Dave Lee Roth and Ted Templeman quaking in their snakeskins. Synth. Ted and Dave fought tooth and nail to keep synthesizers off this album. Ted and Dave wanted their guitar god to stay just that, But their guitar god was having none of it. Eddie wanted to develop, create, experiment, and synthesizers were a part of that. And nothing exemplified that more than the totally outrageous synth-driven instrumental Sunday Afternoon in the Park. I mean, I'm amazed, even with his resoluteness to do the album his way, that Eddie ever got such a personal, i.e. the track was supposedly inspired by the constant arguments he was having with his fiancée, and musically intrusive moment on this record. Sunday Afternoon in the Park is a heavy, grinding, multi-layered synth deluge, the like of which Van Halen had never done before, and never would again, and which would later, weirdly, become part of Michael Anthony's bass solo live. Just on a side note, it wasn't the first time Eddie had used synths. There is some stealthy synthing on Van Halen 2. An interesting fact, when writing Sunday Afternoon in the Park, Eddie also came up with a synth riff that would later become Jump. But let's not get carried away. Fair Warning is above all a hard and heavy record, a guitarist record, and consequently it had a huge effect on up-and-coming metal guitarists. Pantera's Dimebag Darrell cites it as a major influence. Eddie's guitar work on this album is jaw-dropping. This is different league from any previous Van Halen album. And on one level, it was Eddie's answer to the new kid on the block, Randy Rhoads. With his technical exploits on Ozzy Osbourne's first two records, Rhoads was being touted as the new guitar god. And Eddie didn't like that. Eddie didn't like that one bit. And you have to remember that their rivalry went way back before either of them were famous. Eddie used Fair Warning to show who the true daddy was. The gauntlet was laid down in the very first seconds of the very first track, Mean Streets. When I first heard it, my jaw hit the shag pile because I just had never heard anything like it. To the extent of I didn't even know what he was doing. I mean, what the hell was he doing? Well, it turns out he was actually executing thumb finger slap mutes while whistling his way through rapid fire harmonic note alternating taps. A guitarist who shall be unnamed after listening to the Fair Warning album said it was, quote, one of the biggest paradigm shifts in the history of guitar playing, end quote. Take that, Randy. Rest in peace. Have to say, and it is time to give, some credit here to the much maligned Mr. Roth, because Roth had to eventually respond lyrically and vocally to this album's dark, heavy direction. And he did so admirably, coming up with a far grittier, darker vibe. His lyrics were generally downbeat, cynical, and the tone of his delivery was snarling, angry, sneering, perfectly suited the music. Even Eddie begrudgingly admitted that Dave Lee Roth eventually, when he saw the way the wind was blowing, pulled his weight. But there are so many clues before you even play this album, hinting that it's going to be a very different Van Halen record. The title itself is a word to the wise. The cover art is another clue. The desiccated graffiti on the inside and details from the maze as the cover, a painting by William Kurilek, mispronounced, depicting the tortures of his youth. When Eddie saw it, he was in such a bad place that these pictures resonated, and he blew up and used part of the maze for the album cover. And onto the album. Well, it's all out attack from the off. Mean Streets, Dirty Movies, Sinner's Swing, Hear About It Later, Unchained. Every song is a monster, a killer juggernaut, faultless. It's not until the sixth song, and there are only 9, the reggae push comes to shove, that things start to slow down. It's a watershed moment, with Roth delivering his best vocal performance. Probably because he pushed for this song. I.e., when discussing the track, Eddie Van Halen said that Roth had pestered him to come up with something that was, quote, trying to cash in on the reggae thing, end quote. Whatever the hell that meant. Then to finish, we have the single, So This Is Love, and there's nothing wrong with the song per se, but I feel it sits uneasily on the record. It's a throwback attempt to satisfy a record company who must have been having kittens looking for a hit. Then, of course, the album finishes insanely. First, the instrumental, Sunday Afternoon in the Park, which we've already talked about, which then spews straight into One Foot Out the Door, which is another track unlike anything Van Halen had done before. It's a fast, cold, dirty, industrial edge number that for some reason they cut very, very short. In conclusion, above all, Fair Warning is an album of disillusionment and aggressive reaction. Everything is heavier, everything is elevated. In the past, Eddie had gone back to old demos and reworked them for Van Halen albums, but he didn't do that for Fair Warning, apart from the opener, Mean Streets. Originally, this was an old song, heavily reworked, called Voodoo Queen. Fair Warning is a great album that demands more from the listener, because so many ideas are working themselves out at different levels. Placement-wise, out of the 12 studio albums Van Halen have released, I would consequently place this third. Well, I hope you've been entertained. I hope you've been informed. Please leave a comment, smash a like, and subscribe, because all these things help me with my chronic halitosis.